Gary Peterson had always believed he was special. At 48 years old, he had spent the last 12 years as a city councilman, and in his mind, he owned the town. People knew his name. They saw his face on campaign posters every election, year. When he walked into restaurants, the managers would rush over to shake his hand. Gary loved the attention and power that came with his position. But today was different. Today, Gary Peterson was not walking into a fancy restaurant or a city hall meeting where everyone treated him like royalty. Today, he was walking into a federal courthouse as a defendant, facing serious criminal charges. The morning sun was bright as Gary stepped out of his black luxury car in front of the courthouse steps. Even though he was in trouble, he still dressed like he was going to an important business meeting. His expensive suit was perfectly pressed, his shoes were shiny, and his silver hair was styled just right. Gary believed that looking important would help people remember he was not just any ordinary person facing charges. Behind him walked his defense attorney, Lisa Martinez. She was a smart lawyer who had won many difficult cases, but she looked worried today. She had tried to explain to Gary many times that he needed to be respectful in court, but Gary never really listened to advice from anyone. "Remember what we talked about, Gary," Lisa said as they walked up the courthouse steps. "Let me do the talking. Be polite to the judge. Stand when the judge enters. Answer only when asked directly." Gary waved his hand like he was brushing away a fly. "Lisa, relax. I have been dealing with people in power my whole career. I know how to handle myself in any room." What Gary did not understand was that a federal courtroom was very different from a city council meeting. In city council meetings, Gary was used to being the one in charge. People came to him asking for favors. They needed his vote to get things done. But in this courtroom, Gary was just another person accused of breaking the law. The charges against Gary were serious. For the past 2 years, federal investigators had been looking into how Gary made decisions about city development projects. They discovered that Gary had been taking money from construction companies. In exchange for these payments, Gary would vote to approve their building projects, even when other council members had concerns. The FBI had recordings of phone calls, where Gary promised to help certain companies get city contracts. They had bank records showing mysterious cash deposits into Gary's personal accounts. They had emails where Gary discussed which companies would pay him the most money for his support. Gary had been telling everyone who would listen that the charges were unfair. He claimed that federal investigators were only going after him because he was successful and popular. He told newspaper reporters that he was innocent and that the case was just politics. Gary truly believed that he had done nothing wrong because he had been getting away with these activities for years. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered. Some people were there to support Gary because they had voted for him in past elections. Others were there because they were angry about the corruption charges and wanted to see justice done. News reporters with cameras were asking people questions and taking pictures. Gary stopped at the top of the courthouse steps and smiled for the cameras. Even though he was facing federal criminal charges, he acted like he was at a campaign event. "I want everyone to know that I am innocent of these ridiculous charges," Gary announced to the reporters. "I have served this city faithfully for 12 years. These federal investigators are just trying to destroy a good man who has worked hard for his community." Lisa pulled on Gary's arm, trying to get him to stop talking to the media. She knew that anything Gary said could be used against him later. But Gary enjoyed the attention too much to stop. "The people of this city know who I am," Gary continued. "They know I am an honest man who has always fought for what is right. This whole case is a waste of taxpayers' money." Finally, Lisa managed to get Gary to follow her into the courthouse building. Inside, they had to go through metal detectors and security checks like everyone else. Gary was not happy about being treated like a regular person instead of an important government official. As they walked through the courthouse hallways, Gary looked around with disapproval. The building was old and not as fancy as the modern City Hall where Gary was accustomed to conducting his business. The floors were worn and the walls needed fresh paint. Gary felt that a man of his importance should not have to be in such a place. "This whole building needs to be updated," Gary complained to Lisa as they walked toward the courtroom. "If I was not dealing with this nonsense, I could be working on important city projects instead of wasting time here." Lisa tried once more. to prepare Gary for what was about to happen. Gary, please listen to me carefully. Federal judges are different from the people you usually deal with. Judge Patricia Williams has been on the federal bench for 15 years. She has handled many important cases. You must show her respect. Gary was not really paying attention to Lisa's warning. In his mind, all judges were just people, and Gary had always been good at winning people over. He had charmed voters, business leaders, and other politicians throughout his career. Gary believed that his natural charisma would work on Judge Williams just like it had worked on everyone else. "Do not worry, Lisa," Gary said with confidence. "I have been handling difficult people my whole life. Judges are just people doing a job like everyone else. Once this judge sees what kind of man I am, she will realize these charges are ridiculous." What Gary did not know was that Judge Patricia Williams was not like the people he was used to dealing with. She had grown up in a working-class family and had worked hard to become a lawyer and then a judge. She had seen many powerful people try to use their influence to get special treatment in her courtroom, and she never allowed it. Judge Williams believed that the law was the same for everyone, whether they were wealthy politicians or ordinary citizens. She had built her reputation on being fair but firm, and she did not tolerate anyone who showed disrespect for the court system. As Gary and Lisa approached the courtroom doors, Gary straightened his tie and put on his best politician smile. He was about to meet Judge Patricia Williams, but he had no idea that this encounter would change his life forever. The courtroom was packed with people when Gary Peterson and his lawyer Lisa Martinez walked through the heavy wooden doors. Gary looked around the room like he was inspecting it. The courtroom was larger than he had expected, with tall ceilings and dark wood panels on the walls. Rows of benches filled with spectators faced toward the front where the judge's bench sat high above everything else. Gary recognized some faces in the crowd. There were reporters with notebooks ready to write down everything that happened. Some of his political supporters had come to show their loyalty, while others looked like they were there hoping to see him get in trouble. Gary waved at a few people he knew, acting like he was at a social event instead of a criminal hearing. Lisa guided Gary to the defendant's table on the left side of the courtroom. At the table across from them sat Kevin Brown, the federal prosecutor, who would be presenting the case against Gary. Kevin was a serious man in his 40s who had prosecuted many corruption cases. He had thick folders of evidence stacked neatly in front of him. "All rise," called out the bailiff, a tall man in uniform standing near the judge's bench. The Honorable Judge Patricia Williams presiding. Everyone in the courtroom stood up as Judge Williams entered through a door behind the bench. She was a dignified woman of 52 with graying hair pulled back neatly. She wore the traditional black robes that all federal judges wear, and she moved with quiet confidence as she took her seat at the high bench. Gary looked up at Judge Williams with surprise. He had not bothered to learn much about the judge who would be handling his case. Seeing her now, Gary felt a flash of annoyance. In his mind, he had expected to face an older white man who might understand his position as a fellow member of the establishment. Instead, he was looking at an African-American woman who appeared completely unimpressed by his presence. "Please be seated," Judge Williams said in a clear, strong voice. The courtroom filled with the sound of people sitting down on the wooden benches. Judge Williams opened the file in front of her and began reading from the official documents. "We are here today for the preliminary hearing in the case of United States of America versus Gary Peterson. Mr. Peterson, you are charged with accepting bribes, conspiracy to commit fraud, and abuse of public office." Gary shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Hearing the charges read out loud in the formal courtroom setting made them sound more serious than when he talked about them with reporters outside. "Mr. Peterson," Judge Williams continued, "do you understand the charges that have been brought against you?" Gary started to stand up to answer, but Lisa quickly pulled him back down and whispered, "Wait for me to respond." Lisa stood up properly and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, my client understands the charges and maintains his complete innocence." Judge Williams nodded and made a note in her file. "Very well. Mr. Brown, please present the government's case for why Mr. Peterson should be held for trial." Prosecutor Kevin Brown stood up and began explaining the evidence against Gary. He talked about recorded phone conversations where Gary promised to help construction companies in exchange for money. He described bank records showing suspicious cash deposits. He mentioned emails and text messages that proved Gary had been selling his votes on the city council. As Kevin Brown spoke, Gary became more and more frustrated. He was used to being the one doing the talking in important meetings. He was accustomed to being able to defend himself and argue his point of view. Sitting quietly while someone else talked about him felt wrong and uncomfortable. Gary leaned over to Lisa and whispered loudly enough for others to hear. "This is ridiculous. He is making me sound like a criminal when all I did was normal business." Judge Williams looked down at Gary with a stern expression. "Mr. Peterson, you will remain silent while the prosecutor is speaking, or you will be held in contempt of court." Gary felt his face turn red with anger. No one had spoken to him that way in years. In city council meetings, Gary was the one who told other people to be quiet. He was not used to being told what to do by anyone, especially not in front of a room full of people. "I was just talking to my lawyer," Gary said in a voice loud enough for the whole courtroom to hear. "I thought this was America where a man could talk to his own attorney." Lisa grabbed Gary's arm and whispered urgently, "Gary, please stop talking. You are making this worse." Judge Williams put down her pen and looked directly at Gary. "Mr. Peterson, I am warning you for the second time. You will respect the rules of this courtroom, or there will be consequences." But Gary was beyond listening to warnings. Years of being treated like the most important person in every room had made him believe that normal rules did not apply to him. The idea that this judge thought she could tell him what to do made him angrier by the minute. Kevin Brown continued presenting his case, showing photographs of Gary meeting with construction company owners and copies of checks made out to Gary's personal accounts. The evidence was overwhelming, and Gary knew it looked bad, but he convinced himself that he could explain everything if only he was allowed to speak. When Kevin Brown finished his presentation, Judge Williams turned to Lisa. "Does the defense wish to respond at this time?" Lisa stood up and began a careful professional response about how the government's evidence was circumstantial and that her client deserved the presumption of innocence. But Gary was not satisfied with Lisa's approach. He thought she was being too weak and defensive. Without asking permission or even telling Lisa what he was going to do, Gary suddenly stood up and interrupted his own lawyer. "Your Honor, I need to say something here," Gary announced loudly. "This whole case is a joke and everybody in this room knows it." The courtroom fell silent. Lisa looked horrified and tried to pull Gary back down to his seat, but Gary pushed her hand away. Judge Williams stared at Gary with disbelief. In 15 years on the federal bench, she had never had a defendant interrupt his own attorney and address the court without permission. "Mr. Peterson, sit down immediately," Judge Williams ordered. But Gary was too angry and too used to getting his way to listen. "No, I will not sit down. I have been quiet long enough. I am a respected member of this community, and I deserve better treatment than this." The bailiff took a step toward Gary, ready to restore order if necessary. Reporters in the gallery started writing frantically, knowing they were witnessing something unusual and newsworthy. Judge Williams maintained her composure, but everyone in the courtroom could see that Gary Peterson had just made a terrible mistake. The confrontation that would change everything was about to begin. Gary Peterson stood in the middle of the courtroom, his face red with anger and his fists clenched at his sides. Everyone was staring at him, waiting to see what would happen next. The silence in the room was so complete that people could hear the sound of the air conditioning system humming overhead. Judge Patricia Williams sat perfectly still behind her high bench, looking down at Gary with an expression that revealed nothing about what she was thinking. Her dark eyes were steady and calm, but there was something in them that should have warned Gary to be very careful about his next words. "Mr. Peterson," Judge Williams said in a voice that was quiet but filled with authority, "you will sit down right now, or I will have the bailiff escort you from this courtroom." But Gary was beyond reason. 12 years of being treated like the most important person in his city had convinced him that he could talk his way out of any situation. He looked up at Judge Williams and made the biggest mistake of his life. Listen, here, Gary said, pointing his finger at the judge. I do not know who you think you are, but I am not going to be talked down to by someone like you. The words hung in the air like poison. Lisa Martinez felt her stomach drop as she realized what Gary was about to say. She reached out desperately to grab his arm, but Gary pulled away from her. I have been serving this community for 12 years, Gary continued, his voice getting louder and more aggressive. I work with real judges, real lawyers, real important people. I should not have to sit here and listen to some affirmative action judge who probably only got her job because of her color. The courtroom exploded. People gasped and started talking all at once. Some of Gary's supporters looked shocked and embarrassed. The reporters in the gallery began writing as fast as they could, knowing they were witnessing something that would be front-page news. Judge Williams did not move. She did not raise her voice. She did not show any emotion on her face, but everyone in the courtroom could feel the power of her presence as she stared down at Gary Peterson. Bailiff, Judge Williams said calmly, please restore order in this courtroom. The bailiff, a large man named Officer Johnson, stepped forward and spoke in a booming voice. Everyone will be quiet, or you will be removed from this courtroom immediately. The noise died down, but the tension in the room was so thick it felt hard to breathe. Gary stood there looking pleased with himself, as if he thought his outburst had somehow helped his case. He had no idea that he had just destroyed any chance he might have had of receiving mercy from the court. Judge Williams picked up her gavel and tapped it once on the wooden block beside her. The sharp sound echoed through the silent courtroom. Mr. Peterson, she said, her voice as steady as a rock. You have just shown this court and everyone present exactly what kind of person you are. Your racist comments reveal the true character behind the charges you are facing. Gary opened his mouth to argue, but Judge Williams held up her hand to stop him. You will not speak again unless I give you permission, she continued. Your behavior today has demonstrated a complete lack of respect for this court, for the law, and for basic human decency. Lisa Martinez was frantically trying to think of some way to fix the damage Gary had done, but she knew it was hopeless. In 30 seconds, Gary had destroyed months of careful legal preparation. Judge Williams looked at Gary for a long moment, then made a decision that would change everything. I am calling a recess, she announced. All attorneys will meet with me in my chambers immediately. This court is in recess for 30 minutes. Judge Williams stood up and walked toward the door behind her bench. Lisa grabbed Gary's arm and pulled him toward the side door that led to the judge's chambers. Gary, do you have any idea what you just did? Lisa whispered as they walked down the hallway. You just committed career suicide in front of 50 people in a room full of reporters. Gary was still angry and still convinced he was right. I said what needed to be said. Someone had to stand up to her. She cannot treat me like I am some common criminal. Gary, you are a common criminal, Lisa said, her voice filled with frustration. You are charged with taking bribes, and now you have made everything 10 times worse. They entered Judge Williams's chambers, a smaller room behind the courtroom filled with law books and legal documents. Kevin Brown, the prosecutor, was already there, looking like someone who had just won the lottery. He knew that Gary's outburst had made his job much easier. Judge Williams entered her chambers and closed the door behind her. She took off her black robe and hung it on a hook, then sat down behind her desk. Without the formal robe, she looked smaller, but her authority filled the room just as completely. Mr. Peterson, Judge Williams began, in 15 years as a federal judge, I have never witnessed such disgraceful behavior in my courtroom. Your racist attack on me personally shows exactly the kind of mindset that led to the corruption charges you are facing. Gary started to speak, but Judge Williams cut him off with a look that could have melted steel. I am not finished, she said. Your comments today suggest that you believe you are above the law because of your position, and that you think you can disrespect anyone you consider beneath you. This attitude is exactly what we are dealing with in your criminal case. Judge O. Williams opened a folder on her desk and pulled out several official-looking documents. I am making several decisions right now, she continued. First, you are being held in contempt of court and you will spend the next week in jail to think about your behavior. Second, I am ordering a complete federal investigation into every decision you have made as a city councilman for the past 5 years. Lisa felt like she was going to be sick. Your Honor, please, my client was upset and said things he did not mean. Oh, but he did mean them, Judge Williams replied. Mr. Peterson's words today reveal his true character. If he believes he can treat a federal judge this way, how has he been treating the citizens he was elected to serve? Gary finally understood that he was in serious trouble, but it was too late. Judge Williams was not finished with her announcements. I'm also ordering the FBI to investigate whether Mr. Peterson's racist attitudes have influenced his votes on city council matters, particularly those involving minority contractors and businesses. If he has used his position to discriminate against people based on race, that will be additional federal charges. The room was silent, except for the sound of Gary's heavy breathing. His face had gone from red to pale white as he began to realize what his 30 seconds of anger had cost him. Judge Williams stood up and put her robe back on. We will return to the courtroom now, and I will make these decisions official on the record. Mr. Peterson, you have turned what might have been a simple corruption case into something much more serious. Your racism has consequences, and you are about to learn what those consequences are. When Gary Peterson, Lisa Martinez, and Kevin Brown returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere had changed completely. Word about Gary's racist outburst had already started spreading through the courthouse hallways. People were whispering to each other and pointing at Gary as he walked back to his seat at the defendant's table. Judge Patricia Williams entered the courtroom and took her place behind the bench. Her face showed no emotion, but everyone could sense the power of her anger just beneath the surface. This court is back in session, Judge Williams announced. Mr. Peterson, please stand. Gary stood up slowly, finally beginning to understand that he was in serious trouble. His expensive suit looked wrinkled now, and his confident smile from earlier in the day had completely disappeared. Mr. Peterson, you are hereby held in contempt of court for your disrespectful and racist behavior, Judge Williams declared. You will spend 7 days in the county jail beginning immediately after this hearing. Furthermore, I am ordering a complete federal investigation into all of your activities as a city councilman over the past 5 years. The courtroom buzzed with excitement. Reporters were writing frantically, knowing this was a bigger story than anyone had expected. Gary's supporters looked shocked and embarrassed, while others in the gallery seemed pleased that Gary was finally facing consequences for his behavior. Judge Williams was not finished. I am also ordering the FBI to investigate whether your apparent racist attitudes have influenced any of your votes or decisions that affected minority-owned businesses, minority contractors, or minority citizens in your city. Gary felt his knees get weak. What had started as charges for taking bribes was now growing into something much bigger and more dangerous. This hearing is adjourned, Judge Williams said, hitting her gavel once. Mr. Peterson will be taken into custody immediately. Officer Johnson, the bailiff, walked over to Gary with handcuffs. For the first time in his adult life, Gary Peterson was going to jail. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, cameras flashed throughout the courtroom. Within hours, the story was everywhere. Local television stations interrupted their regular programming to report on Gary's racist attack on Judge Williams. The video that someone had secretly recorded on their phone was already spreading across social media. By evening, the story had reached national news networks. The headline on the local newspaper the next morning read, "City Councilman Makes Racist Attack on Federal Judge." The story included the full details of what Gary had said and Judge Williams' response. The newspaper also printed Gary's mugshot from the county jail, showing him looking tired and defeated. Gary's week in jail was the worst week of his life. He was used to sleeping in his comfortable bed in his large house. Instead, he was sharing a small cell with other criminals, eating terrible food, and wearing an orange jumpsuit. Other prisoners recognized him from the news and made jokes about the mighty politician who thought he was better than everyone else. While Gary sat in jail, the FBI investigation was moving quickly. Federal agents were going through every document, every email, and every phone record they could find from Gary's 12 years as a city councilman. What they discovered was even worse than Judge Williams had suspected. The investigation revealed that Gary had been running the city council like his own personal business for years. He had been taking money from construction companies, but that was only the beginning. The FBI found evidence that Gary had been rejecting qualified minority contractors and giving contracts to white-owned companies that paid him bribes. The federal agents found emails where Gary used racist language to describe minority business owners who tried to bid on city projects, taking money from restaurant owners who wanted special permits, but only helping the white owners while making things difficult for Black and Hispanic restaurant owners, using city employees to do work on his personal property during regular business hours, costing taxpayers thousands of dollars, selling his votes on important city decisions to whoever would pay him the most money, regardless of what was best for the citizens. The FBI also discovered that Gary had been especially cruel to city employees who were minorities. He had blocked promotions for qualified Black and Hispanic workers while promoting less qualified white employees who supported him politically. As news of the investigation spread, Gary's political support began to collapse. Other city council members who had worked with Gary for years started giving interviews to reporters, distancing themselves from him and claiming they had no idea about his corrupt activities. "I am shocked and disgusted by these revelations about Gary Peterson," said City Councilwoman Mary Johnson, who had served alongside Gary for 8 years. "If these charges are true, then Gary has betrayed the trust of every citizen in our city." The mayor, who had often worked with Gary on city projects, held a press conference to announce that he was calling for Gary's immediate resignation from the city council. "The citizens of our city deserve better than this," Mayor Robert Davis said. Gary Peterson's alleged actions and his racist attack on Judge Williams show that he is not fit to serve in public office. But Gary's troubles were just beginning. The FBI investigation had uncovered so much evidence of corruption and discrimination that prosecutor Kevin Brown filed additional charges against Gary. The new charges included civil rights violations, conspiracy to deprive citizens of their constitutional rights, and additional counts of bribery and fraud. Lisa Martinez, Gary's lawyer, tried to arrange a plea deal to reduce Gary's sentence, but Kevin Brown was not interested in making any deals. The case had become too public and too serious for plea bargaining. Mr. Peterson had multiple opportunities to show respect for the law and for the rights of all citizens, Kevin Brown told reporters. Instead, he chose to continue his pattern of corruption and racism. The people deserve to see justice done, in this case. Gary's family was also suffering from the scandal. His wife, Carol Peterson, had been active in several charity organizations, but she was asked to resign from her volunteer positions because of the negative publicity. Their 2 adult children, who lived in other cities, stopped answering reporters' phone calls and refused to comment about their father's situation. The Peterson family's reputation in the community was destroyed. People who had once treated them like celebrities now crossed the street to avoid talking to them. Local businesses that had once competed to donate money to Gary's political campaigns now wanted nothing to do with the Peterson name. Gary's expensive house, which he had bought with money from his corrupt deals, was being watched by FBI agents who were collecting evidence. His bank accounts were frozen while investigators traced where his money had come from. His comfortable life of luxury and power was disappearing piece by piece. Meanwhile, Judge Patricia Williams was receiving praise from around the country for her handling of Gary's racist attack. Legal experts appeared on television to discuss how her response demonstrated the importance of maintaining dignity and authority in the courtroom while ensuring that justice was served fairly for all people, regardless of their race or position in society. 6 months after his racist outburst in Judge Patricia Williams's courtroom, Gary Peterson sat in a different room facing the same judge. This time he was wearing an orange prison jumpsuit instead of his expensive suit. His silver hair was messy, and his face looked pale and thin. The confident politician who had walked into the courthouse that first day was gone forever. The FBI investigation had uncovered more corruption than anyone had imagined. Gary was now facing 23 separate criminal charges, including bribery, fraud, civil rights violations, and conspiracy. The evidence against him filled dozens of boxes that were stacked on the prosecutor's table. Lisa Martinez had tried her best to defend Gary, but the evidence was overwhelming. Phone recordings, bank records, emails, and testimony from dozens of witnesses painted a clear picture of Gary's corrupt activities over 12 years as a city councilman. The trial had lasted for 3 weeks. Every day, more shocking details about Gary's behavior came to light. Witnesses testified about how Gary had demanded bribes from business owners who wanted permits or contracts from the city. Minority business owners told heartbreaking stories about how Gary had refused to work with them because of their race, even when they offered the lowest bids on city projects. One witness was Maria Rodriguez, a Hispanic woman who owned a small construction company. She testified that Gary had told her directly that he would never give city contracts to people like her, no matter how qualified she was or how low her bids were. Another witness was James Washington, a black restaurant owner who had tried for years to get a special permit to expand his business. James testified that Gary had demanded a $20,000 bribe and had used racist language when describing why he did not want to help black business owners. The most damaging testimony came from Gary's own assistant, Linda Thompson, who had worked in the city council office for 8 years. Linda had kept detailed records of Gary's phone calls and meetings because she suspected he was doing something illegal. She testified that Gary had often made racist comments about minority citizens and had bragged about how much money he was making from his corrupt deals. During the trial, Gary's behavior became worse instead of better. He often talked loudly to his lawyer during witness testimony, rolled his eyes when people testified against him, and made faces that showed he thought the whole process was unfair. Judge Williams had to warn him several times about his courtroom behavior, but Gary never seemed to learn his lesson. When it came time for Gary to testify in his own defense, Lisa Martinez advised him not to take the witness stand. She knew that Gary's arrogance and racism would only make things worse for him, but Gary insisted on testifying because he believed he could convince the jury that he had done nothing wrong. Gary's testimony was a disaster. Under cross-examination by prosecutor Kevin Brown, Gary became angry and defensive. He claimed that all the witnesses were lying and that the FBI had made up evidence against him. When Kevin Brown asked him about his racist comments to Judge Williams, Gary said he had been under stress but still maintained that he had been treated unfairly. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours before reaching their verdict. They found Gary Peterson guilty on all 23 counts. When the jury foreman read the verdict, Gary's face turned white and he slumped in his chair. For the first time since the whole ordeal began, Gary seemed to understand that his life as he knew it was over. 3 weeks later, Gary stood before Judge Williams for his sentencing hearing. The courtroom was packed with people who had been hurt by Gary's corrupt actions over the years. Many of the minority business owners and city employees who had suffered because of Gary's racism were there to see justice finally served. Judge Williams looked down at Gary with the same calm authority she had shown during his racist outburst months earlier. Gary was no longer the arrogant politician who had insulted her. He was just a broken man waiting to learn his fate. "Mr. Peterson," Judge Williams began, "you have been found guilty of corruption, bribery, fraud, and civil rights violations. Your actions over 12 years as a city councilman represent one of the most serious cases of public corruption this court has ever seen." Judge Williams paused and looked through the documents in front of her. "Your racist attack on me in this courtroom 6 months ago revealed the true character behind your criminal behavior. Your actions show a man who believed he was above the law and who used his position to discriminate against citizens based on their race." Gary's wife, Carol, sat in the gallery, crying quietly. Their 2 adult children had refused to come to the sentencing hearing because they were too ashamed of their father's behavior. "The evidence shows that you stole hundreds of thousands of dollars from the taxpayers of your city," Judge Williams continued. "More importantly, you violated the civil rights of minority citizens and business owners, denying them equal treatment under the law because of your racist beliefs." Judge Williams picked up a document and read from it. "Gary Peterson, I sentence you to 12 years in federal prison. You will also pay $400,000 in fines and restitution to the city and to the businesses you harmed through your corrupt actions. The courtroom erupted in applause. Many of the people who had been hurt by Gary's actions were finally seeing justice done. Gary's head dropped to his hands as he realized he would spend the next 12 years of his life in prison. But Judge Williams was not finished. Furthermore, you are permanently banned from holding any public office for the rest of your life. You will never again have the opportunity to abuse the trust that citizens place in their elected officials. Gary was led away in handcuffs for the final time. As he walked past the gallery, he could see the faces of all the people he had hurt through his corruption and racism. Some looked satisfied that justice had been served, while others just looked sad that it had taken so long for Gary's crimes to be discovered. The story of Gary Peterson's downfall became a national example of how racism and corruption in government would not be tolerated. Judge Patricia Williams received hundreds of letters from people across the country praising her for standing up to Gary's racist attack and ensuring that justice was served fairly. 2 years later, Judge Williams was nominated for a position on a higher federal court. During her confirmation hearing, senators from both political parties praised her handling of the Gary Peterson case as an example of judicial excellence. The city that Gary had represented for 12 years began to heal from the damage he had caused. New ethics rules were put in place to prevent future corruption. Minority-owned businesses that had been shut out during Gary's time in office finally began receiving fair treatment in city contracts and permits. Gary Peterson, meanwhile, spent his days in federal prison thinking about how 30 seconds of racist anger had destroyed his entire life. The man who had once believed he was above the law learned that justice applies to everyone, regardless of their position or power. His arrogance and racism had not only cost him his freedom, but it also exposed years of corruption that might never have been discovered if he had simply shown respect for Judge Patricia Williams and the law she represented.